Hello and welcome to Special Session. This is the podcast where we discuss the top political stories in the state of Utah and break them down for you so you understand how we got here and where we may be headed. I'm your host, Bryan Schott. Before we get started today, a little note about the show. I'm retooling how we do some of the things here on Special Session. We'll be recording and putting out shorter episodes, but publishing them more frequently so they're more timely and more relevant to what's happening right now. Also, at least one episode per week will be subscriber only for our paid members who subscribe at the sustainer level, which is about $10 per month. You can subscribe at utahpoliticalwatch.news. That starts next week. Those subscribers are the ones who make these podcasts possible, who make my journalism possible. So I'm giving them something extra that brings a little more value to their subscription. So going forward, shorter episodes, more frequent episodes, and at least one of them a week will be subscriber only. Now that that's out of the way, on with today's episode. We have to talk about Utah Senate President Stuart Adams. A little bit of a warning here. We're going to be discussing sexual crimes, sexual offenses in today's show. So if you have young kids listening or if you're bothered by these discussions, go ahead and skip now and I'll catch you on the next episode. I'm going to pause so you have time to either turn it off or usher the younger ears out of the room. Okay, here we go. This is the story in broad strokes, and I'm sure you've heard about this, but in case you haven't, last week news broke that in 2024, Adams quietly sparked a change to Utah law that indirectly benefited his step-granddaughter, who was facing 4 first-degree felonies for child rape. In 2023, Adams' granddaughter was charged with 2 counts of first-degree felony child rape and 2 counts of first-degree felony sodomy on a child because of a pair of incidents with a victim who was a 13-year-old male. In Utah, 13-year-olds cannot consent to sex. She was an adult, and the victim was a child. Keep that in mind. So that happened in 2023. During the 2024 legislature, Adams approached Republican Senator Kirk Cullimore and made him aware of the situation involving his granddaughter. Cullimore consulted with the defense attorney for Adams' granddaughter. In response, he inserted some language into a larger omnibus crime bill that allowed for prosecutors to treat 18-year-olds who have sex with 13-year-olds as a juvenile in certain circumstances. Instead of a first-degree felony, because 18-year-olds are adults, 13-year-olds cannot consent, they are children. Instead of being charged with a first-degree felony, they can be charged with a third-degree felony, but only if the 18-year-old is still in high school and there was no coercion involved in the incident. That provision and the rest of the bill passed without much notice. A few months after the law changed, Adams' step-granddaughter got a plea deal in this case with a significantly reduced sentence. Instead of 4 first-degree felonies, she pled guilty to a second-degree felony and 3 misdemeanors. Instead of possibly spending years behind bars, she got no additional jail time, paid a $1,500 fine, had to go through counseling, and had to do community service, and she was also on probation. She does not have to register as a sex offender. Now, this law was not made retroactive, so it didn't apply to Adams' granddaughter. But she did benefit from that change, at least indirectly. The prosecutor, the defense attorney, the one that Senator Cullimore consulted with on this change, and the judge all pointed to this change in the law and the, quote, legislative intent behind it, and that's what led to this plea deal for Adams' granddaughter. Instead of 4 first-degree felonies, it was a second-degree felony. The law says a third-degree felony, but you got a second-degree felony. So, again, they were not applying these new standards to her case, but they were aware of the change and said that the legislative intent, what lawmakers wanted, was a big part of the reason why Adams' granddaughter got this plea deal. So that's the story in a nutshell. Looking at the timeline and how all of this went down, there is certainly an argument to be made that the change to the law, which again only happened because Adams talked to Cullimore about the situation involving his step-granddaughter, indirectly benefited a close member of Adams' family. Adams is currently facing calls to resign because there's at least the appearance that he used his position to benefit a family member. One can certainly make that argument. Now, Adams is defending himself. He says that his hands are clean in this case. He points to the fact that the law was not retroactive. His granddaughter pled guilty to a second-degree felony, while this change in the law says it's a third-degree felony. So, it's not the same thing. And he's defending the process behind how this change to the law came about. He says every bill that's run in the legislature has to come from somewhere, and most of them either come from lobbyists or someone in the community or the personal experience of lawmakers. In an interview with KSL this week, Adams said there was absolutely nothing unusual about how this change to the law came about. And in that same interview, he called the process perfect. No matter what Adams says to defend himself, that the process was perfect, that this law was not applied to his granddaughter, that there was nothing unusual about this process, you cannot deny that the optics are terrible in this case. There was no transparency with how this change to the law came about. And you cannot ignore these facts. This change to the law was included in a larger omnibus crime bill. All of the recommendations that made it into that bill came from a working group that discussed changing these criminal statutes for quite a long time, for several months before the bill was drafted. The only one they did not consider was this change that was sparked by Adams. This was the only thing that they did not talk about that eventually made it into that bill. This change to the law is a very narrowly tailored change. It only applies in certain circumstances. But those circumstances just happen to fit the situation that Adams' granddaughter was facing. It's really hard to get past those two pieces of information when you consider that Adams says the process behind this bill was not flawed and it was quote-unquote perfect. And Adams really isn't doing himself a lot of favors here. In that KSL interview, Adams said that the incident involving his granddaughter, the one where she was charged with child rape, he called it a quote, stupid mistake. Stupid mistake, child rape? Potato, I guess. Also, Adams is currently attacking the media for bringing this story up. He claims that they're victimizing his granddaughter. In that KSL interview, Adams says his step-granddaughter has been through enough. She's been traumatized enough. She was arrested at her school. She went to jail for 8 days. She was under home arrest for more than 500 days. She had to wear an ankle monitor. It was all very embarrassing, and now they're dredging her through the mud again. His quote was, "What a humiliating event. Now we're heaping on her a scarlet letter on her forehead. It's wrong. The stories are wrong. She's been convicted and tried, and now we're doing it again in the media, and it's wrong." This is pure deflection by Adams. He doesn't want to answer questions about this anymore, so he's decided to hide behind his granddaughter. He wants to deflect from what the real story is, the appearance that he used his position as one of the most powerful legislators in the state of Utah to push through a change to the law that ended up benefiting his granddaughter, who was facing years in jail. Understand that Adam's step-granddaughter is not the victim here. That's the 13-year-old. The 13-year-old child in this case. Adam's step-granddaughter was an adult when this happened. She was 18. She's an adult now. The real victim is the 13-year-old child. But Adams is hiding behind his granddaughter, claiming she's being victimized. She's having to go through this trauma again. But we haven't heard him voicing similar concerns about the victim here. The 13-year-old child child who was part of this, the 13-year-old who was victimized by his step-granddaughter, who was an adult and facing first-degree felony charges for child rape until she got a plea deal. We don't hear Adams talking about that. By the way, it's pretty clear that the victim's mother was not 100% on board with the plea deal that was given to Adams' granddaughter. She didn't attend the sentencing hearing, and at the time, the prosecutor said it was because she felt there wasn't enough consideration being given to her son in this case. You know, her son, the victim. And Adams is attacking the media, so let's talk about how the media behaved in this case. The media is not acting irresponsibly by reporting this story. It is a legitimate story. And I could argue that they were extremely careful, even overly careful, when reporting this story. They gave a lot of deference to Adams when they were reporting this. When the Salt Lake Tribune first reported this story, there were very few details about the perpetrator or the victim. There was no mention of their genders and no specifics about exactly how the perpetrator was related to Adams. They just said a relative of Adams. And one could easily think they were talking about a cousin. They were talking about a nephew, a distant relative. There was a whole spectrum of relationships to Adams that this could have covered. They were very vague in their reporting. A few days later, after I read all of the court documents, I was able to pin down that it was Adams' grandchild who was the perpetrator in this case, which changes the story, at least in my opinion, and I'm sure it does in public perception as well, because that familial relationship was much closer than many people realized. And the Senate actually confirmed to me that it was a step-grandchild when I laid out how I knew that it was his grandchild. They said it was actually a step-grandchild. I knew what gender the perpetrator was. I knew the gender of the victim, but I chose not to include them in this story because I didn't think it was relevant. It didn't play a role in this story. In fact, the public only learned of the genders of the people in this story, that the perpetrator was Adam's step-granddaughter, and that the victim was male after KSL reported their story. So if anything, the media was overly careful about reporting this story. They were very deferential to Adams when reporting this out. So for him to claim that the media is acting irresponsibly in this case, it is not a good faith argument. He's not arguing that in good faith. So where do we go from here? Well, what Adams did is not illegal. In fact, he followed the process on the Hill. Lawmakers propose bills. They propose laws. Everybody goes through a committee hearing. Everybody gets to vote up or down. And then it goes to the governor for his signature or veto. So what Adams did is not illegal. He followed the process. His claim that this was how the process works is absolutely true. But it looks awful. The optics are terrible, and it casts a cloud over his leadership, over the Senate, and over the legislature as a whole, because it colors how people are going to look at them, and it diminishes trust in that institution. There is a perception, fair or unfair, that lawmakers do things to benefit themselves and that they're trying to benefit from legislation. They're in it for themselves. They're trying to help out a family member. And this only adds to that perception. Fair or unfair, this only adds to that. And now people can ask questions about any piece of legislation that comes up on the Hill. It's a legitimate question going forward. You can't brush this off anymore because it's not illegal, but it's hard to ignore the fact that Adams' step-granddaughter was facing time in jail. The law changed, and then she got a much more lenient sentence in this case. It's really hard to get past that. And that, I think, is going to cast a shadow over the legislature going forward. Adams and his defenders say that they were just fixing a policy gap. They were just fixing a problem they saw in the law. But why did this need fixing now? The only reason they realized it, quote, needed fixing was because Adams' granddaughter, his step-granddaughter, was facing jail time. That's the only reason that this came up. So yeah, there are going to be questions about this. It just reinforces the perception, again, fair or unfair, that lawmakers are out of touch with their constituents, that they are benefiting themselves, that they want to derive a benefit for themselves, derive a benefit for their family, not in every piece of legislation, but those questions are going to come up. This was not an issue until it impacted a close member of Adams' family. The solution they came up with was narrowly tailored and just so happened to exactly fit the situation that was impacting Adams' step-granddaughter. And then directly, indirectly, she got a benefit out of this. These are legitimate questions. I wrote a story about this week. There's a pattern of behavior for Adams where he has this tendency to dance in the gray area of what is considered ethical and what is not considered ethical. Last year, I reported that there were multiple complaints about the way that he reported his campaign finance. State law says that when you make a payment to a vendor, you cannot list a credit card company as the payee. But for years, almost a decade, Adams, and for his campaign and for a couple of political action committees that he controls, was reporting only payments made to American Express. Thousands of dollars of payments, not providing any detail. State law says you have to provide detail on this, but he wasn't doing that, and there were complaints filed. When Adams was contacted by the Lieutenant Governor's office about this and told that his filing was deficient, he also got some conflicting information that said what he was doing was okay. So he continued to do it. When it flared up again, he pointed to that conflicting information, and then the Lieutenant Governor's office said, well, yeah, you've been doing it wrong. You've been breaking state campaign finance law. This is law that's explicitly spelled out in the code. You've been breaking it, but we're not going to enforce it. So Adams got off, even though he had been breaking the law for years, simply because somebody gave him some conflicting information. And you could argue that as the president of the Senate, he should have known, he should be aware of what the campaign finance laws say. But that's not how he operated for years and years. In 2022, he and a couple of his grandchildren traveled to Qatar for the World Cup to watch the United States play in a match. That trip was paid for by the Qatari government. That's not illegal here in Utah. There's also not a requirement that you have to report that. Former Attorney General Sean Reyes also traveled to Qatar for the World Cup, and the Qatari government picked up the tab for that trip, or at least picked up most of the tab for that trip. Again, you didn't have to disclose it because the law does not require that. A few months before Adams and his grandchildren traveled to Qatar for the World Cup, the Senate blocked a bill that was sponsored by Republican Representative Candace Perucci that would have required public officials in Utah who accept gifts or travel from foreign governments to disclose them. Wouldn't have made them illegal, just that you had to disclose them, but the Senate blocked that piece of legislation. Perucci's been trying to run that bill ever since, but it has not gotten out of rules the last couple of years. Made it to the Senate in 2022, got blocked, and we haven't seen it yet, but she still keeps filing it. So again, there's more of that perception because a bill that would have required public disclosure of this kind of trip gets blocked, and then Adams takes a trip to Qatar, and it just feeds into this perception that is causing people to lose trust in government. Look at what happened during the COVID pandemic. Right before the 2022 session, the week before the 2022 session, Adams tested positive for COVID. But he was there on opening day, and during his opening speech to the legislature, he triumphantly announced that he had tested negative that morning. That wasn't true. He actually tested positive twice, but didn't bother to tell anyone. In fact, he lied about it. And the Senate only acknowledged that he tested positive, that he had misspoken or had, lied about his COVID test after the media started asking questions. Meanwhile, he was standing there in close contact with people. He wasn't wearing a mask, which was the guidance at the time. And he was conducting business as usual, knowing that he had tested positive twice. In 2020, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Utah purchased about 20,000 doses of the anti-malarial drug hydroxychloroquine, which we know doesn't do anything for COVID, but it was all the rage at the time. They spent $800,000 with this pharmacy. The pharmacy was called Meds in Motion. The owner was Dan Richards, and he had established a relationship with Adams during the early stages of the pandemic because they had connected as part of this informal group of Utah policymakers and business leaders and community leaders who helped shape the state's initial response. The state purchased those drugs from Richard's Pharmacy, Meds in Motion, without telling anyone at the health department. When the media asked the health department about this invoice for 20,000 doses of hydroxychloroquine, the health department didn't know anything about it. Now, there was no evidence that Adams was involved with that, but his close relationship with Richards cast a shadow on it. But there was another incident. Richards was bringing in more of these drugs, and when one of his shipments got stopped in California, he reached out to high-ranking officials in the state, including Adams, asking for help getting it out of customs. And a few days later, Adams himself asked the director of the Utah Inland Port Authority to lend a hand. Adams stepped in and used his clout to help out Richards. And it just so happened that Adams, at the time, was a huge proponent of using hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID, even though there was absolutely no evidence that it worked. I had spent a lot of time going through old news reports with Adams, old news articles. And he's got a long paper trail. He's been in Utah politics for quite a long time. And there was a story from 2011 that really jumped out at me. It's not online anymore. I had to find it through LexisNexis. But in 2011, the Utah Department of Transportation was planning to erect a billboard near South Main Street and I-15 in Layton. And the land that they were going to put this billboard on was owned by UDOT. And they met with city officials and chose this spot for this billboard. It was part of a billboard relocation that happened when they built another construction project. So they had to move these billboards, and this was one of the places where they were going to relocate it to. Adams was in the Senate at the time. The previous year he had taken over for Greg Bell, who had become the lieutenant governor when former Governor Huntsman left to become the ambassador to China, and Lieutenant Governor Gary Herbert became the governor, and Herbert tapped Bell to be his lieutenant governor. Bell was in the Senate at the time. Adams was actually the other finalist for that job, and Herbert, when choosing between the two of them, chose Greg Bell, and Adams then moved into Bell's Senate seat. Adams was in the Senate at the time, and shortly before construction on this billboard was set to start, Adams heard from some constituents who called him to complain about the billboard. And so Adams started making some calls to UDOT officials, to state officials, trying to figure out what was going on, and he successfully stopped construction of this billboard. Now, Adams did have a lot of pull. Not only was he in the Senate, he was the former chairman of the Utah Transportation Commission, and he was a member of the Senate Transportation, Public Utilities, and Technology Committee. So he had those connections, and transportation officials would listen to him. And he got this billboard blocked. Well, the constituents that reached out to him to get this billboard stopped, they were his mom and dad. Just happened to be his mom and dad who lived across the street from where this billboard was supposed to go up. Now, Adams said his parents weren't aware that there was going to be a billboard going up in that location until construction started, and he faulted UDOT for not holding any hearings allowing residents to voice their concerns about the billboard, even though that wasn't a requirement at the time. And in those news reports, he said that he would have made the same calls if anyone else had raised concerns about the billboard, but the people who complained were his mom and dad, and that's why he stepped in. Now, as I said at this time, state law did not require UDOT to seek approval from the city council or hold a public hearing on the billboard placement. UDOT went through the proper channels. They went through the process. But Adams got it stopped because his parents objected to it. So we know that he's not averse to stepping in and throwing his weight around to help a member of his family. He did it back in 2021 to stop a billboard. Bottom line is that politically, this story is extremely damaging, not only for Adams, but for the Utah legislature as a whole. It damages public trust in our institutions. It adds to this perception, earned or not, fair or not, that public officials use their power to benefit their friends, benefit their family. I don't know if that's a fair assessment or not, but it just adds to that perception. And that's why this is so damaging. Now, Adams is facing calls to resign. He says he's not going to. I don't know what kind of public pressure is going to come out of this. I don't know if the pressure is going to sustain on this, whether he's going to be able to sweep this under the rug, whether everyone's just going to move past this. But it's an extremely damaging story, and there are still a lot of questions about it that I don't think that we've gotten sufficient answers for. Now, Adams is up for re-election in 2026, and we'll see if there's any sort of backlash, but my sense is there won't be. Voters in Utah have shown that they're not going to punish Republican lawmakers for what they see as bad behavior. Take a look at what happened when they gutted the Better Boundaries Initiative, Medicaid expansion, and medical cannabis. The legislature gutted those initiatives, which were approved by a majority of voters. They didn't suffer any consequences. Look at what happened with Amendment D last year, where lawmakers rushed into special session in August to put a question on the ballot that would have allowed them to override any citizen initiative. It had misleading language. Adams was involved in the writing of that language, which was struck down by the Utah Supreme Court. They didn't suffer any consequences in the 2024 election. The numbers in the legislature remain the same. Democrats flipped one seat, Republicans flipped one seat, and that was it. So the lesson that legislators take from that is you're not going to get punished for this kind of behavior. Voters aren't going to hold you accountable. At least they haven't yet. Will it happen to Adams? It remains to be seen, but history shows that it's unlikely to happen. Thank you so much for listening. That's going to do it for this episode. But before we go, I need you to do me a favor. Go to YouTube, go to social media, and follow Utah Political Watch on anywhere that you can. That helps you keep up to date on our coverage of Utah politics. Also, go like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, wherever. That helps this reach more people. You can check out my journalism at utahpoliticalwatch.news, sign up for my newsletter for free, or you can support my work by becoming a paid subscriber or even making a one-time donation. You can find that at utahpoliticalwatch.news. Links are in the show notes. And you know what? I love hearing from listeners and readers. Drop me an email or send me a message on social media. All of you who have reached out to me in the past are amazing, and I'd love to hear from more of you. Send your questions, your comments, your criticisms, recipes, suggestions for the show, suggestions for the newsletter, all of it, send it my way. You can do that on social media or my email, again, linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. You all are incredible. You're amazing. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'll be back with another episode of Special Session real soon. Bye.